this nugget concludes our discussion on project risk and project risk management. Our first two nuggets on risk focused on the identification and the analysis of risk events so that we could proactively identify the appropriate strategies to eliminate or minimize or put contingencies in place to minimize the impact of the risks on the project. This nugget focuses on the activities for monitoring and control, the ongoing day-to-day activities involved with project delivery where you're monitoring the known risks. The list of risks that you identified with the appropriate strategies that you couldn't eliminate, that you've identified contingency or mitigation strategies, the ongoing monitoring of the known risks to ensure that you identify when the risk is occurring and that you're putting the appropriate strategies in place to minimize the risk when it is occurring. It's all about watching for new risks. Although the risk identification process we did during planning was as exhaustive and complete as possible, as the project delivers, you will understand new information, new activities will be uncovered, and therefore it's important that you're looking for new risks and you're, again, going through the complete planning process to analyze, to develop strategies, to put contingencies in place to deal with new risks as they became known. It's all about managing the contingency. You have a fund of dollars, you have a reserve of time available to deal with the known risks and the unknown risks on the project. Managing the contingency during project delivery is ensuring that you are effectively managing the contingency, that you're not using up all of the contingency on the first risk event and having no contingency left. It's all about ensuring that the contingency is properly managed and distributed and allocated throughout the duration of your project. The first step in monitoring control is to monitor the known risks. To look at the risk register, examine the events in the risk register, determine the likelihood of the risk occurring, determining the timeline with which the risk is likely to occur, and ensuring that you are taking appropriate actions to eliminate, to mitigate, to deal with the risks as they occur. So how do we do that? Let's have a look at our risk register. Here we see the risk register from the previous nugget more completely filled out. We have identified more risks in our risk register. And in fact, we have added additional detail, we've added the risk management strategy, and we put in the critical date. Now in this case, I have simply put it in a relative term, this week, this month, next month, 3 months out. In a true project delivery situation, you would be putting in actual project critical dates. And we're starting to fill in the current status for the risk events. Now I have sorted my risk register by critical date. I see that I have the events that are likely to occur that need to be monitored immediately at the top, and then as we go down the risk register, we're seeing the events are getting further and further out in our project timeline. So we need to focus on the top events in our risk register. So this week we have to deal with inadequate training. We see its probability is medium. The risk management strategy is to mitigate. And currently it's not an issue. So it looks like we might get lucky on this one, that the inadequate training issue may disappear, and hopefully in the very near future we will be able to eliminate that risk from our risk register and saying the critical date has passed and we can eliminate the risk. The next one, staff availability, the impact is high. The management strategy is transfer. If we were to look at our detailed risk management plan, we would see something to the extent of, if we cannot get the staff we need to go out and hire a consultant, or we need to hire a temporary resource. It's looking like we need to take that action immediately, and the current status is 3 programmers not available. So it is about time to go out and deal with the issue and find those contract resources to bring in to ensure our project does not deal with a resource availability shortfall. Then we're looking at the ones on the near scope. The network capacity, continue to review. It's a medium, we're going to mitigate it, and sometime this month we're going to have to take action on this risk. As well, the programmer learning curve is a low, so we're not going to watch that one as diligently, but again, sometime this month we're going to have to deal with the fact whether we have a programmer learning curve or not, and in both of these instances we're continuing to review the situation. As we get further out on our timeline, the next month, increasing competition, medium accept, is increasing scrutiny. It's beginning to show up on our radar screen. We need to start to examine the impacts related to increasing competition to determine the impact it's going to have on our project. We have other very serious risk events. We have the interface incompatibilities as a high and the business availability for training as a medium, but their timeline is substantially removed from the project, 3 months out and 6 months out. So at this point in time, we're actually not taking any active to-do risk management, but as the timeline moves and they move up on our risk register, we will begin to act on those. So if we go back to the activities related to monitoring the known risks, the key tool we have is our risk register. We need to ensure we're continuing to monitor our risk register, that we're continuing to review the known risks that are on the risk register and continuing to take the appropriate actions to monitor their status and taking the appropriate actions to put our strategies in place, the hiring of the 3 contract programmers as required to support to deliver the project successfully. The key item that we need to be aware of is the project timeline. We can't deal with all of the risks because there's simply too much to manage at one point in time, so we need to focus on the project timeline and deal with the risks that are immediate to our project and let the risks that are further out in the timeline wait until they become more urgent, more pressing to our project. The principle that we just talked about of monitoring risks that are near timeline closely and observing risks that are further out in the timeline, I like to refer to as my risk radar. We need to focus on those risk events that are in the near future, the immediate, the 1 to 2 weeks. We need to watch the risk events that are further out on our timeline, that are the 2 to 4 weeks. We need to monitor the risk events that are even further out, the 5 weeks to 8 weeks. And we need to observe the risk events that are further out on the radar screen. You need to ensure that you're focusing, watching, monitoring, and observing the appropriate risks based on the information in your risk profile. Focus on the risks that are immediate. Focus on the risks that you need to take action on immediately to ensure that you're putting the appropriate actions in place, that you're taking the appropriate strategies to eliminate, to remove, to mitigate the impacts of the risk. You're watching the risks that are close to happening on your project. Now, to date, we focused on time, the 1 to 2 weeks, the 2 to 4 weeks, etc. You also need to be aware of the profile of the risk. How high is the impact? How high is the probability? So if you have a risk event that's in the 2 to 4 week window, but it's a high probability and a high impact, that in fact is sufficient that you need to move it into the focus component to your risk radar. As a project manager, you need to be effectively managing the risk radar for your project to ensure that the high profile, high urgency, or immediate time frame risks are being carefully monitored and focused on by you, the project manager, but that you don't lose sight of the other risks and that they're still out there on the observed list. They're still on your risk register, and they're still items that you're going to deal with on an as-required basis. Just because they're 8+ weeks out, they could still have actions happening against them that's going to change your impact, change your assessment of the risk. It may change the timeline. It may change the urgency. It may change the impact of the risk that's going to necessitate moving the risk in from the observe ring to the monitor, to the watch, or even to the focus. So don't get fixated on the focus. I want you to pay a lot of attention to the focus, but don't get so fixated on them that you ignore the other risks in your risk profile. You need to do careful risk management throughout while still ensuring that you're observing the principles of the risk radar, that you're not trying to take actions on the observes when action on the observes really provides no immediate value to your project. So as you can see, ongoing risk management is a multifaceted process. You need to be aware of the risk radar, you need to be aware of timelines, and you need to be aware of the profile for each individual risk, the urgency and the impact for the risk. You need to be monitoring, observing, watching all of the risks and making sure that you're focusing your attention on the appropriate risks. And that's the key component to project risk management, the key component to monitoring and control. Focusing on the appropriate risks, focusing on the risks that you have the capacity to take action on, or focusing on the risks that you need to take action on immediately to ensure your project delivers successfully. Take the appropriate actions, put the contingencies in place, apply your mitigation strategies, apply your transference strategies to minimize the impact that the risk is going to have on your project. As important as it is to monitor the known risks, it's equally important during project delivery to watch for new risks. The original risk plan that you created during project planning was as complete and comprehensive as possible. But because it was created during project planning, there were significant a number of project facts that you simply did not have at hand. Now that the project is unfolding, you're going to have a lot more information about the project scenarios. You're going to have a lot more information about events and activities that can impact your project success. Therefore, you have lots of opportunity to identify new risks, and you have lots of opportunity to put new risk management plans in place to mitigate, to eliminate, to transfer the new risks before they become actual risks on your project. Where can new risks come from? Scope changes. As the project scope changes, as you add functionality or remove functionality, risk events are going to change. You need to ensure that with each and every scope change, with each and every change control processed for your project, that you're identifying any new risks that are associated with the scope change. As the schedule changes, as the schedule becomes tighter or as the schedule becomes more relaxed, different events will happen, different processes in the project will have different urgencies, therefore the risk impact or the risk possibility for the schedule will change. As the schedule changes, you need to reassess the impact for risks and take the appropriate actions. As the environment changes, an environment changes is multifaceted. It can be the technical environment for your project, it can be the competitive environment within which your business is operating. It can be the business environment. It can be changes to your project sponsor. It can be changes to the business environment. There are a large number of environmental changes that can have significant impact on the risk profile for your project, have significant impact to the events that you must be monitoring as a project manager to ensure that the project is being delivered successfully and that you're taking the appropriate proactive actions to minimize, to eliminate, to transfer risks. Ask your team. Your team are the people on the ground, in the know, that have precise information about the project. They will know whether a risk event has occurred. They will know whether new risks are being identified. When you identify new risks, you need to go through the complete planning process. You need to identify the risk. You need to identify the issues associated with the risk. You need to identify the contingency, the time, the schedule, the dollars. You need to develop a complete risk analysis for each new risk identified. You need to develop a risk management plan for the specific risk. You need to put the risk on the risk register. You need to put the risk on your risk radar. And where appropriate, based on the impact, the probability of the risk, the need for additional funding, the need for additional schedule allocations, you may need to go back to the sponsor, you may need to go back to the business to say, there is a new risk identified, we need to allocate an additional $5,000, or we need to allocate an additional week or 2 weeks worth of schedule contingency to ensure that we can deal with the risk proactively. Simply identifying new risks and saying, oh, there's something bad happening on the project, without going back to the business and telling the business about the risk impact, that you may need more money, you may need more schedule changes, is not doing a proper job of risk management. Managing the contingency is the most difficult part of risk management, the most difficult part of monitoring and control. We have defined our contingency into 3 buckets. We have the known risks. We have risk number 1 with a contingency of 5 days and $5,000. We have our unknown risks where we have a general contingency of 20 days and $25,000. And we have these on-plan deviations. Let's deal with managing the contingency 1 column at a time. So first we have the known risks. Risk number 1 has a contingency of 5 days and $5,000. It's critical as a project manager that you reserve those 5 days, that $5,000, specifically related to that risk event. If that risk event is going to occur in month 3 of your project, that 5-day contingency, that $5,000 of funding needs to be reserved, needs to be untouched until month 3 for the project, and the risk either materializes or the risk disappears. I want to stress this. Preserve the contingency for your known risks until the risk event occurs. It's very tempting in week 1 of the project or month 1 of the project to say, I have a deviation. I have bad estimates. I've lost 5 days. I've lost, coincidentally, $5,000 in project delivery funds. I'm going to simply start to consume my contingency as a result of bad estimates. Absolutely the wrong strategy to apply. If you have bad estimates, it's time to go back to the project plan. It's time to go back to the project sponsor and say, we've determined that we improperly estimated phase 1 for our project. We misestimated the number of business processes. We misestimated the amount of work to be done. Therefore, as a result of bad estimates, we need to go through and allocate additional time, additional funds to the project. That is a project occurrence that is really unrelated to risk, or maybe you had a risk event related to bad estimates, but in most instances, you believe your estimates are as good and as realistic as possible, so that is simply a project delivery fact that needs to be dealt with, that you had bad estimates, that is totally unrelated to risk. You need to reserve each individual risk event, risk 1 through risk 15, the time allocated to each risk event independently, and only consume that time, those dollars associated with that risk event, when in fact the events around risk number 1 have happened. It's 3 months into your project, and you have in fact determined that risk number 1 has happened, and you deploy the time or you deploy the dollars, or better case, the risk has not happened, and therefore you have extra funds available. But what about the general contingency? We've allocated 20 days, $25,000 of general contingency for the unknown risks. When you consume the general contingency is really at your discretion. You have this additional funds of 20 days, $25,000 to deal with unknown risks. If you truly consider bad estimates as an unknown risk, then you're within your rights to take that 5 days, $5,000, and apply it against the 20-day, $25,000 contingency, general contingency fund. However, you need to ensure that when you're using this 20-day, $25,000 of unknown contingency, that in fact you are truly applying it against risk events. And I would like to suggest that bad estimates are not a risk event. General contingency unknowns would deal with some other unknown, uncontemplated, unrealized issue that could result in project delivery challenges. So let's assume that you have an unknown risk event called bandwidth. And you simply have to buy more capacity for your network, and that extra network capacity is going to cost you $8,000. That would be an unknown risk event, and that $8,000 would be applied against your general contingency, and the general contingency would then be reduced to $17,000. You need to ensure that when you're applying your general contingency that you're truly dealing with unknown risks, and that you're taking the appropriate actions to ensure your project is delivered, that you're consuming your general contingency for true risk events, and that you are not consuming your contingency for typical ongoing project delivery challenges. So in the unplanned deviation column, we need to rationalize everything. So we have our known risks, And I'm going to simplify it. I'm just going to include risk number 1 here at 5 days and 5K. We have our unknown of 20 days and $25,000, and we have our plan deviations, the bad estimates, at 5 days and $5,000. It's important as we're going through and dealing with our contingency, dealing with the fact that we are now delivering our project, that we're taking the appropriate actions. As I've said, you need to reserve known risk events for when that risk event occurs. If 5 days, $5,000 is not going to be known until month 3 of the project, make sure you do not consume those funds, those schedule allocations until that point in time. Do not start to use up your project contingency simply because you have planned deviations, you have bad estimates, you have resources that are late joining the project. There's all kinds of ongoing project delivery challenges that's going to result in planned deviations that are not related to risk. But we do have this unknown, the 20 days, the $25,000. As I suggest, it should be reserved for unknown risks and consumed when unknown risks are realized. But as the project delivers, you are now 75% of the way through the project, and 8 of your planned risks, or 8 of your known risks, their date has transpired, and you have additional funds of $8,000 and 10 days. At this point in time, you have capacity to deal with unknown deviations. At this point in time, you have extra capacity of an extra funds of $8,000 and 10 days, and by this point in time, you may have only consumed 10 days and $12,000 of the actual unplanned contingency, that in fact you can start to apply contingency funds against planned deviations. Now this may seem confusing, this may seem ambiguous to you. Unfortunately, that is the case with risk management. As we said, going into these nuggets on risk management is very challenging. Risk management is focused on dealing with unknowns. Risk management is focused on putting together strategies to deal with unknown events, dealing with unplanned deviations, dealing with how to consume your actual contingency is again based on unknowns. The key to managing contingency is to reserve the funds for the known risks until the risk event occurs or transpires without occurrence. The key to managing contingency is ensure that you're using your contingency, your general contingency, only when a true risk event happens, that you're not consuming it for planned deviations. And as you're dealing with the project, as you're delivering the project, as your known risks transpire and you have extra funds available because risk events did not happen, then it is acceptable to apply that against planned deviations. But at all points in time, as we've discussed, you need to have full, open, honest communications to the project sponsors to let them know how the risk funds are being managed, to let them understand how the schedule contingencies are being consumed so that there are no surprises. And that's the key to managing the contingency, is to ensure there's no surprises. The big thing you have to watch is that you're not consuming contingency early in the project to hide schedule deviations, that you are reserving the risk events, the risk contingency, for later in the project at the 75% complete level, when it is truly known that the project is likely to succeed and that it is acceptable to begin to consume contingency for simple planned deviations, as opposed to reserving the contingency for the actual risk events. So to conclude this nugget on risk management, actually to conclude this series of 3 nuggets on project risk management, we focused on the aspects for monitoring and control. We've ensured that we have effective risk radar screens in place, that we're monitoring all known risks, and that we're dealing with only the risks that have a high probability, high impact, and are immediately evident on the project timeline. We're ensuring that as new information transpires on the project, that we have more information about the project delivery situation that we're looking for, identifying, and dealing with new risks as they materialize, as they become known to the project. And most importantly, and probably the most difficult aspect to deal with, is managing the contingency. We need to ensure that contingency reserves for known risks are reserved until that risk event transpires or disappears. We ensure that we manage our general contingency funds for true risk events, that we don't consume any of our risk contingency for standard, regular, ongoing planned deviations as a result of bad estimates, as a result of resource unavailabilities, as a result of other project delivery challenges, that the contingency is reserved for the true risk event, and only after the risk events have transpired, only after you as a project manager feel that you have complete control of the risk situation, can you actually provide relief to project deviations from your contingency fund. The key to contingency is ensuring that if you put the contingency aside for risk events, that the contingency is preserved until the risk event happens. This concludes our nugget on project risk management. I hope this video has been informative for you, and thank you very much for viewing.